Greetings, everyone. This is Memorial Day. It's being recorded, so you don't hold me responsible for things that happen in the next few days. I want to say a couple of things before I get going. First, if you see that my left eye is red, it's not because Dale punched me, but because I have an eye infection. And then you may notice that I'm wearing a red shirt, and that is purposeful because the main thrust of today will be about China and not about the virus, but about China in international affairs. So if you're interested in more details about internal and about China and the virus and Wuhan and all of that, there was an excellent program, a CNN special with Fareed Zakarian last night, which was the 24th, I guess, on the whole development of the virus in China, etc. It's a really first-rate program, and you can probably still find it online. So before I get to China, let me just make some stray comments about events. They're not totally unrelated. The first one, you might have heard that the internal auditor for the State Department was fired. That, along with, over the last few months, 4 others. These individuals who were meant to be neutral and not political and deal with internal department issues developed after Watergate, and they've, on the whole, played a terribly useful function. The reason I want to focus for a minute on the State Department one is he was investigating 2 things, or so they say. One was Secretary of State Pompeo's use of State Department and security officials to get his dry cleaning and walk his dog and all of that, which is improper. But the other thing was the fact that he cleared arms sale to Saudi Arabia. Congress had passed legislation banning further arms sale to Saudi Arabia, and he overrid Congress by declaring a security emergency, which almost everybody can do, right, if there's a real emergency, so as to sell more arms to Saudi Arabia. Now, why is this relevant? Because the arms of Saudi Arabia go to that horrendous, awful, deathly war in Yemen. And it was an attempt for Congress not to want to encourage the use of American arms in Yemen. Now, Yemen is complicated in a number of ways because hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and starved to death and died of various diseases. But now, of course, the virus is also looming on the horizon in Yemen. And concern about that led the United Nations Security Council to pass a resolution that said that the civil wars in various countries, for example, in Yemen, should be put on hold. There should be a temporary, at least, ceasefire so that the viruses around that are spreading around various civil wars, and of course other countries, non-civil war countries as well, can be dealt with by international governmental and non-governmental health organizations. Well, what kind of health organizations? Well, the World Health Organization, for example, as well as, Doctors Without Borders, etc. Now, the Security Council was very careful not to mention the World Health Organization because they realized there would be a Trump administration opposition and tirade against the World Health Organization, and the resolution couldn't pass. So they left out the names of the organization, and even so, the United States vetoed it. And that is, a further stain on the United States and its human rights and its concerns of others, that even a resolution urging ceasefires and in various civil wars so that people could be treated for the virus, and or the virus could be slowed down, is really a kind of a nightmare. And it went under the radar screen because we're concerned about all these other things. The last time I talked about the World Trade Organization, I'm sorry, the World Health Organization, and since we spoke, they had their annual conference where leaders from around the world and representatives from other CDCs, public health agencies in various governments met. And the US was there to make trouble, to threaten not only that it wasn't going to pay what it promised, but that it would actually leave the World Health Organization. But in addition, it raised the issue of Taiwan, because Taiwan is not a member of any of the intergovernmental agencies of the United Nations, for the obvious historical reason that Taiwan is considered part of China, and China will veto or oppose Taiwan being part of anything. This has been an ongoing issue for years, and they continue to be an issue. But the thing is that the United States, even a dumb person in the United States State Department would know that the very worst thing you can do to get an agenda on a perfectly good subject like dealing with the virus off the agenda is by the US insisting that Taiwan somehow become a member. The truth of the matter is, though, that the United States was completely ignored and the World Health Organization just continued with its business. That is increasingly happening. That is to say, the US is out to lunch as a world leader, as a constructive participant. And while we in the United States, who oppose the policies of the current administration, may wring our hands, many countries in the world and many bureaucrats and international institutions have essentially thrown up their hands and decided the best thing to do is to ignore the United States. Now, this is a tragedy for us, right? The most powerful, influential country for 70 years after the Second World War. And now we're looked at as a failed state, and we're looked at as somebody that either shouldn't be consulted, or when we pipe up, it is best to ignore the United States. One other final comment is that the World Trade Organization, which I mentioned by accident, the head of the World Trade Organization has just resigned. And the World Trade Organization is another one of these important institutions that deals with world trade, has been helpful to the US and other countries. We have charged them with being partial to China, China not paying enough, so forth and so on. We've refused to participate in appointing new judges who deliberate when there are conflicts in international trade. So the organization essentially has been toothless since the Trump administration has come into power by and large. And now the head of that organization has just had it, and he has resigned. And of course, it's going to be incredibly difficult for a new person of stature and quality, or a new person at all, to be appointed, because the US will veto everyone and will not play ball. So you have yet another UN agency which plays a very useful role and has played a very useful role, even for US policy, being, in a sense, undermined. So pile on one thing after another. So let me turn to China. Historically, after the Chinese Revolution, China played a very small role in world affairs. And in the last 20 or so years, as China miraculously went from a poor country to a by and large affluent country with a state-of-the-art industry, state-of-the-art science, education, a historical first, what China has managed to do in the last few decades. Roughly 1 billion people out of the Chinese population of 1.3 or 4 are no longer in poverty, right? And the Chinese economy was buzzing. And China obviously was a rising power, and China even at the end of the Obama administration, was clearly now the new competitor for the United States, the second biggest power, and needed to be taken seriously. And by and large, the Obama administration took China seriously in that, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership organizing trade agreements with Asia was on the agenda, as well as having negotiations with China on climate change and so forth. Trump administration comes into power, and it is still dealing with China, but it's beginning to make derogatory comments one way or the other. Meantime, internal to China, the authoritarian government of China under Xi became more and more autocratic and started clamping down on centralizing in all kinds of ways. In some ways, sometimes in good ways. For example, clamping down on corruption, but in other ways, reducing access to the internet and so forth. There is no question in anybody's mind that China is an authoritarian, autocratic state. And when the US was its counter major power in world affairs, it was in a position to organize not only itself, but other countries in discussing and criticizing and trying to develop reasonable relationships. It must be said that there are two schools of thought on this. On the one hand, there is the school of thought, which I adhere to, which is even talking to your enemies is a good idea, because negotiations are the ways to prevent conflict and war, and also in the long term are in your own national interest. And the other school of thought is, well, if there is a bad government, you just don't deal with them, you condemn them. Under Trump, of course, there's been a hypocrisy, right? There are lots of authoritarian governments around the world. For example, Russia. For example, Brazil. For example, Hungary. For example, Egypt. For example, lots of countries which have authoritarian and autocratic leaders. And the Trump administration is perfectly happy to deal with them, right? And has been since it's been in power. So our relationship with all the countries I just mentioned have been, fairly normal in many ways, and often congratulations to the leaders. Some of them have visited the United States, and we all know about the friendliness between the United States, or at least Trump and Russia. Now, there are some authoritarian governments which the Trump administration has been consistently hostile to. One of them is Cuba, and the other is Iran, and we can get back to those discussions some other time. What has been happening in recent years, even before the virus, is that China, which was basically very disengaged from world affairs and focusing on its domestic affairs, started outreach. And its outreach started economically. We've talked about the building of the Silk Road all the way from China to Italy, the huge Chinese investments in all of those countries, not just building transportation, but building dams, investing in hospitals, being a major donor to many countries in the world, even not along the Silk Route, in Latin America and in Africa and so forth. And so China has reconfigured its role in the world and emerged from a very major but internally directed power to becoming increasingly it's the second dominant major power in the world, in world affairs. First in economic affairs, increasingly also military affairs, selling arms to other countries, certainly in technology, and certainly one of the driving forces in the globalization of almost everything: manufacturing, science, research, education, travel, investments, and so forth. So now we have a Trump administration which is blowing hot and cold about China's asserting itself in world affairs. And now we get the virus. And the virus is, to put it mildly, mishandled in the United States. Uh, I mean, others now look at us as a kind of a failed state. And the blame, as you all know, is given to China. And of course, there's a lot of distortion and outright lies about that, because while it's true that China messed up in the beginning in Wuhan and so forth, eventually China Wuhan situation became centralized and Xi took over control of the situation. They did keep it quiet too long, but by January, was it 12th or so, the World Health Organization was informed. Certainly by the end of January, the world knew what was going on. And it was the United States that delayed acting seriously on the health crisis related to the virus for 6 weeks after everything was known. So we're simply lying about saying that the fact that we have this huge outbreak, which, by the way, will get much worse this summer, every specialist thinks, is to be blamed on China and the cover up in Wuhan. No, the countries that accepted China's information when China gave international information and immediately took action, managed to control the virus, be it South Korea, be it Taiwan, be it Vietnam, be it most of the Scandinavian countries, even European country like Germany. They acted upon the information from the World Health Organization as well as the Chinese government. We did not. So now we're blaming China, right? And we're blaming China on all our failings. And the problematic here is that the consequence of the US being out to lunch, China expanding and trying to expand its world reach, and perceiving itself now not just as the competing power with the United States, but conceivably the dominant power in many world affairs, because the United States is out to lunch, right? And is blaming China. Many countries in the world don't take our blaming China serious anymore, because by now they say you have to blame the Trump administration, that even in February still denied that there was a problem, that we waited 6 weeks until Trump even acknowledged that it wasn't just a breakout among a few people and it would soon go away. And the handling of the crisis, it's a joke worldwide, right? And in the interim, the Chinese are saying to themselves, or so I think, not only are we now in a position to be not just the competing world power, but in many ways the dominant power, and given their authoritarian nature and given their ambition and given how Xi looks at the world, they are now acting out internationally in ways that where they were not acting out when they knew they would get resistance from the United States and the United States leadership in the world to resist Chinese bad behavior internationally. How do we know this? Well, the most recent event, of course, is the Chinese trying to change the rules pertaining to Hong Kong. You have no doubt heard or read about that. That is to say, they, at their big gathering this past week, they passed new legislation which essentially put security clampers on China, which was, one nation, two systems. The agreement that was made when Hong Kong, when England, Britain ceased being the colonial power in Hong Kong, was that the rules that gave Hong Kong special rights, separation politically from China would last, I think it's going to run out in 2046, for 50 years. It was started in the 1980s. So that in a way, China is breaking its commitment to honor its commitments at the time when Britain ceased being the colonial power and Hong Kong got independence. Now, when the folks at Hong Kong had demonstrations some months ago having to do with clamping down on security internal to Hong Kong according to Chinese wishes. The Hong Kong government was in a position to want to slow down, and China backed off. How do we know they backed off? They didn't invade Hong Kong, which they could have done, right? Now I'm not so sure anymore. That is to say, if things go out of control and demonstrations so forth in Hong Kong this time, will China back off? Maybe yes and maybe no. I don't know the answer. But the problem here is that the resistance that China would have felt that might have been costly might not be there under the Trump administration and under the lack of American leadership and the virus and so forth. So China is now not just doing economic outreach and making friends and influencing people in every imaginable country, but China now politically is taking actions it has wanted to take for a long time, but didn't dare do so, right? So the next concern is Taiwan, because Taiwan, in the mainland Chinese view, is part of China, right? And Taiwan, of course, is protected by the United States military and its commitment to Taiwan. Now, the question, of course, is if they would move seriously on Taiwan, we might, in fact, have a war. This might get very serious. And all one can do is hope that the Hong Kong situation is going to be somehow fudged and that the Chinese government and Xi will not feel empowered to overstep the mark in Hong Kong. Because if he does so, and if he gets away with it, then Taiwan's situation is really at risk. And in the case of Hong Kong, certainly the Trump administration may make noise, but we're probably not going to do very much of anything. But in the case of Taiwan, that is not really possible. So I guess what I'm saying is that the political situation internationally that has developed over the virus, over the Trump policy, over blaming China, over trying to make China look bad as possible, is in fact having not only internal domestic consequences in China, but is in fact leading China and Xi, who seems to more or less be in charge of everything, is letting Xi reconfigure his role of China in world affairs. And this is now a really, really dangerous business. The other thing I quickly want to say about this is that whenever the Republicans have been critical of China over the years, for reasons that are maybe not obscure politically, but are really very bad, the Democrats tend to jump on the bandwagon. And one of the really bad things happening right now is not only is the Trump administration accusing China of every possible thing, obviously virus related, but also other things. But even Biden is making negative China remarks, as are senators and congresspeople. Now, it's fair to say it's an autocratic regime, and it's fair to say that one should criticize it. It is just very, very bad politics to overreact, to get in bed with Republicans overreacting on these situations. Don't forget the Democrats went along with the invasion of Iraq and several other things like this, again, because they thought it was good politics. It's bad politics. And insofar as one has any influence on local congressmen or writing one senators, stop the China bashing. Yes, there's serious trade issues, there's serious relational issues of all kinds with China. But accusing China, bashing China, calling China names, and overreacting on China is not going to produce better behavior either domestically or internationally on the part of China. So I think China has now moved not just to, which it already is, to the virus situation, but China now is problematic again in world affairs, or not again, but really for the first time since the revolution, in world affairs in a way that it wasn't before. So I think we better watch this all very carefully, and we better inform ourselves, because it might feel comfortable to blame somebody else on our domestic miseries with the virus and uh, globalism and trade and the populism of the right and left, which I will get back to down the road. But this China bashing is out of control, and sensible, informed criticism might be fair, but making China look bad is not a recipe for better Chinese domestic or international behavior. And since China is a huge economic power, even though they're having difficulties, is a big political power, yes, they're having domestic political difficulties, is a monumentally huge influence in many, many countries. Yes, there are negative aspects. You know, China has loaned tons of money to all these countries, and they can now repay it because of economic circumstance. So China is going to have difficulty with all those countries that they invested and gave loans to. Yes, China has all kinds of problems and issues, but we're going to have problems and issues, as will the rest of the so-called democratic world, if we don't start being more sophisticated about dealing with China. So this is all negative news, and you always want me to add with some positive news. And there is some positive news, and I will talk about it some more next week. And that is, given the economic situation in Europe, Angela Merkel of Germany, for the first time, has decided, rather than condemning Southern European countries for their own economic failing, that Northern European countries, and especially Germany, should help fiscally the Southern European countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, and so forth. That is a whole new posture. And is Angela Merkel trying to organize the European Union countries? I'm not sure she's going to be successful with all of them, to say it is in the interest of Europe in general to help other European countries. The European the European Central Bank, which deals with monetary issues, can't deal with it alone. Fiscally, we have to make loans. We have to help those other countries. What that is doing to some extent is reviving the somewhat moribund European Union a little bit, and gives hope to those who believe the European Union is still important and should continue to play an important role. It's helping those countries think again about the European Union. Yes, Great Britain is still out to lunch. Yes, London, which also could exercise leadership, is not doing so. Johnson is in some ways as bad a news as Trump is for Great Britain. So they're having to do this, the Europeans are, without British leadership and without American leadership, which is very sad and problematic. But the fact that Angela Merkel, in her waning days, when everybody thought she was a spent force, is rising to the occasion and trying to rope European countries in taking seriously its European obligation, is very important and very promising and very good news. The other thing, which is a small piece of good news, is that the European Court of Justice ruled against Hungary and Orban against their refugee camps and policies along the border. And Orban, who has not been listening or paying attention to any of the human rights norms within the European Union, of which he is a part, and has violating freedom of the press and human rights of every kind, all of a sudden decided to step back and listen to the Court of Justice and closed those camps along the border and opened more higher quality, presumably, camps more inland in Hungary. This is the first sign of Orban taking seriously some at least modest commitments to the human rights norms of the European Union. Whether this is a one-off, I cannot tell you, but between Angela Merkel and wanting to help the Southern European members of the European Union, and Orban being a little bit respectful of the European human rights norms, that is indeed very good news about Europe. And since we're missing good news, that is to be paid attention to. Next time, I really will talk about the environment, because the virus and the political events in the world have had an impact on environmental degradation, but also on environmental policy and the future of how we might think about going forward with climate change. So that will be on the agenda for next time. Thank you very much for listening and tuning in. See you and listen to, I don't know, I guess you see me nowadays, so listen to me in a couple of weeks when I will do the next one. Thank you. Bye.